Welcome to our Rosh Kollel reading list. I'm delighted to introduce you to this beautiful and profound volume, Letters to Sam, A Grandfather's Lessons on Love, Loss, and the Gifts of Life by Daniel Gottleib. Dr. Gottleib is a practicing psychologist and family therapist in Philadelphia who writes a series of letters to his grandson. His only grandson, who he finds out shortly after he's born, is affected by a serious form of autism. His young grandson is named Sam. And he writes letters of the life lessons that he's learned in an extraordinary life journey that took an unusual turn when he was driving on the highway and across the interstate. Unfortunately, Lo Aleinu, a giant 100-pound tire came loose from a semi-truck, crossed the median, and crushed his car. He became a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the waist down. He ultimately ended up divorced and living alone and managing in this new reality. There are many lessons to be drawn from this volume that dovetail with our Torah traditions. He has a unique perspective, especially as someone who is notably and happily identified as a Jew. Dr. Gottlieb, he exudes humility. On page 84, he describes how he was interviewed for a radio show, which is something that he's done in Philadelphia's NPR affiliate WHYY for years. He was interviewed as guest lecturer and expert on a show concerning substance abuse. He was interviewed by three kids who asked good, probing questions. One of the questions, he says, stumped me, and I said so. I don't know, I told the young man. I'll look it up. Give me a call on Monday. End quote. Afterward, he writes, one of the program engineers approached me to say he'd been blown away by that response. Quote, I've never, ever heard someone say, I don't know on this show, he told me. It was the first time in my life I'd been praised for saying those three words. And it changed something in me. Ever since, I have not hesitated to use them. The idea of not knowing is okay. Isn't that the truth about the deepest mysteries of the world? Eini Yodea is something that appears in Rashi, on Chumash, and other places. Aim Yaakov Esav, when we describe how Rivka Imenu appears in Chumash, and Rashi says, why does it have to say that she was the mother of Yaakov and Esav? Rashi says, Eini Yodea, I don't know. So some ask, why did Rashi have to say Eini Yodea? Why does he have to add a comment, I don't know why that's there? Why doesn't he just say nothing? Because he wants us to know that sometimes it's important to ask a question, even if we don't have an answer. That is the definition of humility. Humility is self-awareness of knowing what we don't know and what we do know. Knowing our place in the world around us, knowing the mysteries that are beyond and the great koach that we have within, and the confidence to say, I don't know that. In addition to the humility of this work, one of the beautiful themes that shines through is humanity. When we embrace our humanity, that Tselem Elokim, that reality that is the distinct human being of every individual person, we have the opportunity to transform ourselves and to impact others on a deep human level. We're all just a Tselem Elokim. Perhaps the most profound and poignant episode that he describes in this work, which is very emotional and intense at times. He describes the way that he dealt with shame. Shame is an extremely powerful emotion, and he talks about the power of shame to affect a person. But, he says, believe it or not, because exposure can cause shame, exposure can heal it too. And when that happens, it is a very freeing experience. And I think this, to me, is about that exposure, that realization that we're all human, and that shame, the concept of being ashamed, shouldn't be associated with being human and having limitations, similar to the idea of Eini Yodea. And then he goes on to tell this story. One evening, I was sitting in my office having a session with a 17-year-old girl. She was complaining about her physical appearance. She hated the way she looked. Hearing her describe herself I felt sad because, like most girls, she was beautiful, but her sense of shame made it impossible for her to see that. She measured her appearance against other girls in her class or young models she saw in magazines. And when she made these comparisons, she didn't like herself. How could I help her? I knew that reassurance would be a waste of time and maybe even harmful. If I made positive comments about her looks, as most people probably did, she would feel that I didn't understand her suffering and didn't care to. I knew that from all the times people had tried to reassure me, it made me feel even worse about myself and misunderstood on top of that. So there I sat in silence for a moment, just feeling her shame and my sadness for her. To finish this story, I have to tell you something about a very different kind of body, my own. Because my bladder doesn't work, I wear a catheter that drains into a bag strapped to my leg. And occasionally, things go wrong with the catheter. As I was listening to this young girl talk about feeling ugly and unacceptable, I glanced down at my lap and saw that my catheter had leaked. My pants were soaked with urine. I looked up at her, overwhelmed with my own shame, and she looked down and saw my wet pants. I can't imagine a greater embarrassment. If I had been in the presence of anyone else, a boy, a man, even a mature woman, I might have felt less humiliated. But my embarrassment in front of this teenage girl was so intense, I wanted to hide somewhere and cry. Seeing my suffering, she got up from her chair, came over to me, and held me. I was so moved. I just let her care for me as I relaxed. Of course, I had to end the session early, but before I did, we talked about our mutual shame and how painful it is, how some of it is necessary, but some of it isn't. So there we were, Sam, just two human beings feeling the same painful feeling at the same time. Before this happened, she had felt isolated in her quote unquote unacceptable body, and at the moment I saw my pants, I had felt isolated too. We looked into each other's eyes and saw each other at our most vulnerable. And in that instant, the shame went away from both of us because we knew we were understood. Rahman al-Islan, Lo Aleinu, we should never have such challenges, the mental health challenges, the physical challenges. But in our world, we are duped when we see others into thinking they must have it perfect. But we have to realize that everyone is human. Everyone has a pekala. And so we shouldn't be ashamed of ourselves that we have struggles, because that's the nature of how Hashem made us. We are meant to be human. So the humility and the humanity, they go together. They're part of our growth in our spiritual identity, our confidence, our ability to both say Eini Yodea and to embrace others using that humility to connect to their humanity.